Let me introduce Tom Neeley. Tom, for the U.S. governmental perspective, Tom Neeley served as Assistant Administrator serves actually as the USAID's Bureau for Europe and Eurasia. He's had that position for 4 months now, since December. Prior to his arrival at USAID, Mr. Neeley was Executive Director for Democracy International, where among other responsibilities, he was co-leader of DI's International Monitoring Mission for Egypt's 2015 legislative elections. From 2010 to 2015, Mr. Neeley served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And during that time, I recall, he was also very active on Ukraine. These were the Yanukovych years, and I think Tom traveled there at least 4 or 5 times, meeting with both officials and with civil society. Prior to entering government, Mr. Neeley was Deputy Executive Director of Freedom House and served as Vice President of Programs at NDI, the National Democratic Institute. He's also taught graduate programs at Johns Hopkins and Georgetown University. Mr. Neeley, please.
Thank you, Orest. I'm reminded that I have to start providing an incomplete biography because every time I change jobs, it gets longer and longer, and it sounds like I'm older and older, which is not the look I'm going for. So I'm honored and flattered to join you at this event, and mindful of Nadia's admonition, I will try to be brief so that we can get out of the room on time. I want to commend the organizers that brought us together, the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation and its president, the World Affairs Councils, and the other organizations that have pulled this together today, an impressive group of leaders from across academia, civil society, the business world, who are all committed to a democratic, prosperous future for Ukraine, to take stock and to provide fresh ideas and perspectives, and if I understood the last session correctly, to vent just a little. And I'm glad to be reminded, as we were by Carl Gershman in that last session, of the heroism of Nadia Savchenko. It's really quite breathtaking, and it makes you appreciate not only why Ukraine is such a strong nation and why it will prevail, but why Ukrainians in North America, in the United States and Canada, have remained such a tight-knit, such a focused community of people that have kept alive a language and a tradition in ways that many other immigrant communities have not done. And so, as a non-Ukrainian who comes to these gatherings occasionally, I want to pay tribute and offer my respect to the strength of the Ukrainian character as embodied by Nadia Savchenko. The theme for today's forum, Ukraine's battle for freedom continues, is an apt description of the current situation. Little more than 2 years after the Revolution of Dignity led to a new beginning for Ukraine, Ukraine is waging a war on 2 fronts. On the one front, the external front, Ukraine faces continued Russian aggression, including attempts to stifle and undermine its democratic path through political and economic pressure and continued military aggression in violation of international law. The U.S. stands at Ukraine's side to strengthen its resilience and support Ukraine as it pushes back against this Russian pressure, aggression, and occupation. The second front in Ukraine is a battle against an internal enemy that is equally pernicious and that has held Ukraine back from progressing as a democratic, prosperous nation for well over 2 decades. While many of Ukraine's neighbors have moved forward economically and politically after the end of the Cold War, Ukraine often took steps backward as politicians and oligarchs controlling the levers of power hollowed out Ukraine as corruption thrived and the economy stagnated. This battle for genuine democracy, for economic liberty, the battle against entrenched corruption, and the battle for a new European Ukraine, envisioned by the Heavenly Hundred and so many others during the Revolution of Dignity, has challenged existing power structures. Today, Ukrainians are demanding that their leaders think about what they can do for Ukraine rather than what they can take for themselves. That's why it's critical for Ukraine's President Poroshenko and the political parties in the Rada to come together now to form a new government and put in place a real reform agenda that carries out the reforms and furthers European integration. To form a government that serves the Ukrainian people rather than the interests of the oligarchs who know full well that their access to power will be diminished if the reforms that animated the Maidan take hold and are actually implemented. Every day the reform effort is slowed is another day lost for Ukraine. Not only does halted progress erode U.S. and international confidence in Ukraine, but it hands Russia an undeserved, unearned victory. The Maidan Revolution reaffirmed the desire of Ukrainians to freely exercise their rights in an environment where the rule of law is respected and government officials and institutions are held accountable to the people. They are battling for the universal values that bind us as a transatlantic community, for partnership among sovereign equals, for human rights, for transparent government, shared prosperity, and justice under law. Over these past 2 years, Ukraine has made progress that the U.S. and our other international partners in Ukraine applaud. Just 10 days into my current position, in January, I traveled to Ukraine as USAID's new Assistant Administrator for Europe and Eurasia to see firsthand the successes and the progress on reforms, to meet with civil society leaders and Ukrainian officials to better understand the challenges going forward, and to refine our program on how the U.S. can help Ukraine move forward. While we know that more work must be done in Ukraine, and we expect that the imminent Ukrainian government will carry out and implement deeper reforms against corruption, Ukraine has made significant strides in these past 2 years. These areas include strengthening the economy and ensuring energy security. The economy has stabilized due to the sovereign loan guarantees and significant macroeconomic support from the U.S., the IMF, the EU, and others. The U.S. has been a critical partner in most of these reform efforts, providing more than $760 million to Ukraine since the crisis began, as well as providing up to $400 million to guarantee $1 billion sovereign loan guarantees. And we're currently in negotiations with Ukraine over the conditions necessary to implement our third $1 billion loan guarantee. Additionally, U.S. advisors are at work every day in several Ukrainian ministries, helping to support them in the reform process, to help professionalize what had been stagnating post-Soviet government bureaucracies. And we do that more broadly, and I think it sometimes gets forgotten when we talk about U.S. aid to Ukraine, and I'm given these numbers to recite, $760 million and the backing for $2 billion loan guarantees. What we also deploy with this money is a wide range of expertise. Ukrainian Americans and other Americans bringing their professional expertise from NGOs, from corporations, from professional bodies, working hand in glove with Ukrainians to inform and advance their reform process. Today, Ukraine is on a path to economic growth and has already greatly reduced its dependence on Gazprom this winter, leading to greater energy security for Ukrainians, another measure of independence from Russia. For the first time in many years, this year Ukraine did not purchase any gas from Russia during the several months of the winter heating season. Think about that. Think about what that means. Moreover, in this past year in the agricultural sector, Ukraine broke its own record for wheat exports. The Rada has enacted reforms that will enable the development of a civil service that serves the interests of all Ukrainians, not embedded self-serving interests. Ukraine has passed an e-procurement law that will reduce corruption and is already saving the Ukrainian government millions of dollars in the long term, and government has also begun the difficult task of decentralizing power and budget authority to local communities to improve responsiveness and policing for citizens. These reforms, while significant steps in the right direction, are not enough for Ukraine to win the second battle, the battle on the internal front. This month, Ukraine's leaders remain mired in a cycle of infighting and indecision about how to restore trust and effectiveness in the reform coalition and to reboot the government and accelerate its program. Each day that reform is stalled, those who preferred the old Ukraine, the less democratic Ukraine, grow more confident inside and outside the country. Ukraine can no longer afford to be its own worst enemy, standing in the way of reforms, standing in the way of a new future, and instead must push forward and seize this historic opportunity and win the battle to keep, which is the key, the battle against corruption, which is the only real way to secure the battle against the Kremlin's stranglehold in propping up the old Ukraine. Last year, Vice President Biden visited Ukraine and spoke before the Rada, before President Poroshenko and Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, and called on each of them to work harder to eradicate the old habits that were holding back Ukraine. Vice President Biden said, "Each of you has an obligation to seize the opportunity of the sacrifices made in the Maidan the sacrifices of the Heavenly Hundred. Each of you has an obligation to answer the call of history and finally build a united, democratic Ukrainian nation that can stand the test of time. Vice President Biden's exhortation is as relevant today as it was then. So to restore the trust of the Ukrainian people, the government must appoint and confirm a new, credibly reform-minded prosecutor general who will be committed to investigating, indicting, and prosecuting corruption cases. Ukraine must also focus on the remaining legislation that will implement an independent energy regulator and an electricity market law. These laws will reduce unsustainable energy subsidies and accelerate the demonopolization of the gas and electricity markets. These are keys to the privatization of state-owned enterprises that meet international standards and are transparent and ultimately successful. Ukraine must also work harder to reform the judiciary, to reinforce judicial independence. Without these reforms, Ukraine will continue to struggle to meet the conditions needed to engage fully with the rest of Europe and the worldwide economy. Stalled reforms and weakened resolve also have an impact on Ukraine economically as investors fall back, thinking that Ukraine is just not yet a good bet for direct investment and business. The U.S. and Ukraine have already accomplished a great deal together, helping the Ukrainian people seek what they themselves have indicated time and again that they want: a more secure, stable, and prosperous country, embedded in the West and tied to global markets and the worldwide community of democratic nations. Democracy can indeed emerge in the most unlikely places. Ukraine can be a place where democracy not only takes hold but flourishes. Ukraine's battle for freedom will not be easily won, but we believe and hope that the people of Ukraine will do what they have done over the past 2 decades and prove the skeptics wrong and continue along the path towards democracy, freedom, prosperity, and stability. We in the United States government are proud to be Ukraine's partner and will continue to stand by Kiev as it seeks to fulfill its potential to be a prosperous, democratic, and transparent country for all of its citizens. Thank you very much.
In conclusion, obviously there's a lot more that we could have discussed, and I want to be thankful, though, for the opportunity that we did have today. So first, I want to thank all the supporting organizations that have made this forum possible, particularly, especially the Youth Family Fund and the new institution, International Institute for Leadership. I think that's the right name. Also to all our speakers who, as you saw, really represent the best of the minds here in Washington focused on Ukraine. And I want to thank them because they're always very positive in responding to our call. And Audist, for your help in keeping this program on time. And I have to mention our staff, Yulia Solovey, Adrian Karmazin, John Kuhn, and Markian Belinsky. And of course our interns, without whom we could never get anything done like we do. It's my understanding that we have with us one of the soldiers from Ukraine who are in rehab at Walter Reed, Alexander Kosolapov. Is he? He's here? So. We are grateful for the assistance that our government is giving to some of these soldiers at Walter Reed. But as we discussed here, we need to do more to help those who we can't bring to Walter Reed. As we leave, I think we need to be mindful about a couple of things. One is the assistance gap. In September, it was bad. It's worse now. So our job has not been finished, obviously. If we look at sanctions, the threat of removing sanctions, there's no justification. We've heard about the false narrative. It is just as inconceivable that we can let this remain. We have to find a way to battle this. And so, as we did at the end of September, I call on all of us that we have a mission going forward after we leave today. And it really remains pretty much what we said in September. It's in your booklet. We have to pledge that we're going to continue to advocate for increased assistance, continue our appeal to President Obama, and the next President of the United States. And finally, we have to remind the international community that sanctions should not relate not only to Minsk, but also to the return Crimea.